Hello everyone, Gigabeef here, and today we're going to talk about arguably the highest DPS weapon in the entirety of Escape from Tarkov, the SA-58. The sheer damage output that this gun is capable of is legendary, so stick around and let's get going. Okay, so first and foremost, what is the deal with the FAL versus the SA-58? People use the term interchangeably sometimes in EFT given the similarities, but the weapon that we have in the game is a copy of the FAL made by the American company DSA, which is why some of the parts are FAL parts and fit to this gun, the SA-58. I'm not going to talk too much about the real world stuff, but as a non-RL gun person, I found this distinction a little confusing at first. Apparently DSA even brought over the machines used to make the original FAL, so it's as close a copy as you can get. So getting into the weapon itself, there are quite a few ways to access the SA. It has 4 barters across the traders and 2 cash purchases. However, I would ignore the trader cash deals at the moment because in the current state of the game, it's way cheaper on the flea market. Some of the barters are okay, and you get different stuff with each one. The first one is 3 hard drives and 2 sticks of RAM, which goes for about 35 to 40,000, which is terrific value at this point, even for a stock gun. Things have got a bit crazy on the flea market right now, with base SAs going up for 80k at times, so this is a good option for a base weapon in my opinion. The next one is the 4 nicks or lenses from Mechanic, which goes for about 80 to 90,000. The distinguishing features of this are the hybrid 46 suppressor, which I don't recommend using really, but it's a requirement for the thermal M1A quest for Prapor, so it might be a good way to get that in cheap. The stock is a decent choice and everything else is pretty standard or not best in slot, so it's primarily for the suppressor to use on other builds. Number 3 is another barter from Mechanic for 8 weapon parts, which costs you about 100 to 130,000. This has the best non-combination stock and a 50 round drum, but it's not as good, and we'll go through mags later, but you don't need to spend 50,000 on the flea for the drum. The fourth one is a kind of semi-modded one from Mechanic for 12 weapons parts, but this one it's just too much. Basically you get the best in slot handguard and an okay stock, but other than that it's just not worth it. As I mentioned, as an alternative, you can just buy this on the flea, and it usually sits about 50 to 70k, going up to about 80, given its current spawn rates and the ability to spawn on scav run loadouts. Clearly we'll want to mod the SA-58, as the stock weapon comes with something around 165 recoil and 20 ergo, and that's for the versions with the longer 21-inch barrels. The main issue that we face in creating any decent builds here is that we have to compromise between recoil and ergonomics fairly heavily, and getting a good balance is really not straightforward, especially after nerfs to the weapon. This is fair enough in my opinion. As I said, it's basically the highest DPS weapon in the game with a 700 RPM fire rate, which is 50 more than the MDR, which is probably the closest comparable weapon given those are the only 2 full autos in this caliber. However, the MDR, like many of the others, only uses 20 round mags. The SA can use 30 or 50 round mags, which when combined with the 7.62 NATO and the ability to go full auto is pretty insane. To then have low recoil and high ergo possible as well would make most of the other guns in the game fairly useless, to be honest. I've always wanted to like the MDR and it is a good weapon, but as a solo player, fighting squads with 20 round mags is quite hard unless you're single tapping, and if you are, then I'd rather just have an SR25. Anyway, drilling down into the lowest recoil loadout, let's build it up from scratch. So to begin with, we're just going to go and edit the preset from the Peacekeeper Barter one, and we will actually end up editing almost everything about this weapon. So first off, we're going to replace the pistol grip, which only has 3 simple choices, and the best is the AG FAL, and this gives you plus 13 ergonomics from Skier 4 at around 5,000 rubles. Another simple choice that we can just go into first is the receiver or cover, which we can change over to the DSA Arms X Duty, the Extreme Duty version from Mechanic 3, which provides 4 more ergo, but also a Picatinny rail to mount optics on later on, so this is important to add on now. Now, I want to talk about magazines much later, so just for the time being, let's just use the good old British L1A1 FAL magazine as a decent all-rounder. This has an ergo penalty of 8 and can be bought from Peacekeeper 4 at around $50. We'll keep the existing barrel because, as usual in EFT, the longer barrels have the best recoil reducing stats. If you need to buy it, it can be found in Mechanic 4 for 37,000 rubles and reduces recoil by 11% with an ergo penalty of 20. Replacing the handguard, the best in slot here is the Altor CASV from Mechanic 4, and this is the longer version of these two. And for just under 20,000, reduces recoil by 3% and improves ergonomics by 10. To note, this version only fits with the 21-inch barrel version of the SA, the other shorter ones need a shorter handguard to go against them. As for vertical foregrips, this is no different here to the normal best in slot. What we're going to do is take the RK2 from Skier 4 with minus 4% recoil but minus 3 ergo, and this attaches to the CSV 5-inch guide. Now, next up, stocks and muzzles are probably the most complicated part of this weapon. So firstly on stocks, we'll start with the buffer tube adapter for the SA-58 from Mechanic 2, which hurts your ergonomics by 1. And then what we're going to do is we're going to add the Mesa Crosshair Tactical Buffer Tube, which is minus 5% recoil and minus 3 ergonomics from Peacekeeper 4, on which we're going to attach the PRS Gen 3, which is the best in slot for recoil only, with minus 34% recoil and plus 3 ergonomics for Peacekeeper 3, and this gets us our min recoil stock. For muzzles, we'll be using the classic 7.62 NATO 3-part compensator, which comprises of the thread adapter with -1 recoil and -1 ergo for Peacekeeper 3. And then you have the Lantac blast mitigation device, also from Peacekeeper 3, which gives -8 recoil and -3 ergonomics. And finally, the Lantac Dragon comp itself from Peacekeeper 4 with -15% recoil and -2 ergo, which is, as a 3, the most recoil reducing compensator attachment for the muzzle that you can get for this particular weapon. So doing all of this, that gets you to 20 ergonomics and 66 recoil. The equivalent best in slot build was the suppressor using the 2-part Thunderbeast adapter. If we go and grab the CB and Thunderbeast suppressor, gets you to 73 vertical recoil and only 6 ergonomics. An important question that we have to ask here is, what does 66 recoil look like with the SA-58? How usable is this, and is there any room to sacrifice some of this recoil in other builds? I'll throw up a clip here of what the 66 recoil version looks like in the firing range now. Next, let's look at some optimized builds. Effectively, we're going to be maximizing ergo whilst keeping recoil under control. The issue with the low recoil builds is the terrible ergonomics, but clearly we can change this up a bit to increase this stat, and in turn our ADS speed. What makes this difficult with the SA-58 is the extremely high starting recoil, i.e. the recoil with the gun stripped right back to its base. And if we do that now, you can see here that this gets us to 350 base recoil. With this, it makes the recoil extremely sensitive to changes in percentage recoil reduction, as each percentage stat on the weapon part affects the recoil by 3.5 recoil points. If you're interested in more on this topic and exactly how the system works, check out my recoil mechanics video, which I'll link to above. When using the long barrel, it's actually not really possible to get amazing ergo without absolutely destroying your recoil due to the sensitivity that we mentioned before. We're already using the best in slot muzzle and pistol grip, so the only other main areas that we can get ergo from are the foregrip, the stock, or the magazine. In my opinion, there are only a couple of choices that make sense here, obviously talking about maximising these builds for recoil and ergo rather than price. Which are the most efficient decides on which elements we can add. Intuitively taking the lowest recoil weapon that we created and making the classic tweaks to enhance it, i.e. the Fortis shift replacement for the RK2, and on the stock changing out for the PRS Gen 3, over to any of the MOEs with the butt pad, this usually feels like it's going to have the best results. And this is because from a starting stats of 20 ergonomics and 66 recoil, we can look at the result and we can calculate a kind of efficiency score for each part. So for example, if you look at the RK2 to the shift, you can see that originally we started at 20 and 66 and we end up with 12 more ergonomics and 7 more recoil, and that ends up getting us to 32 ergonomics and 73 recoil. And so what that means is that if you look at how many ergonomics you get for how many recoil you sacrifice, then it's actually 1.71 as a ratio. Doing the same thing for the MOE with the butt pad, the SI Advanced Tube, the SA-58 BRS and the PRS-2 foul stocks shows us that the most efficient combinations to sacrifice recoil for are the RK2 to the shift upgrade, which we looked at in the first place, MOE over the Gen 3, and to keep the Mesa Cross, as the Advanced Tube only gives 5 ergonomics for 4 recoil. The two resulting builds then are, as we suspected in the first place, using the shift and the MOE stock on the original Mesa Cross, and that gets you to 39 ergonomics and 77 recoil. Alternatively, what you can do is you can switch out the Mesa Cross for the Advanced Tube, and yes, it's not as efficient, but you do actually sneak out a little bit more ergonomics, and you get 44 ergo here for 81 vertical recoil. And this is, as we said, you get another 5 ergonomics to sacrifice 4 recoil, which might be worth it depending on what you want to do, but I think these two builds are very, very similar. Switching back to the Mesa Cross stock for a second, there is one alternative which is more economic than anything else. It's cheaper and less complicated to build. You can replace the entire thing with the SA-58 BRS instead, and as you can see, this gives you 3 more ergonomics but at the cost of 4 recoil. So again, it's not that efficient, but this is 20,000 rather than 40,000 for all the things you have to buy to make the stock combination with the MOE. Either way, the build that I like here is using the shift, the Mesa Cross and the MOE stock with the butt pad, and that gets you to 39 and 77 vertical recoil, or 25 ergonomics and 84 recoil if you're using the Thunderbeast and want to be suppressed. If we want to go further with this, as in previous builds, we know that shorter barrels give us a better ergonomics statistic at the expense of recoil, and the SA-58 is no different. The barrels in and of themselves give the long barrel for -20 ergonomics and -11 recoil, the medium at -11 ergo and -6 recoil, and the short barrel -5 ergonomics and -2 recoil. I was experimenting recently with using the short barrel version, and although I could just about get the recoil down low enough where full auto is actually useful, the ergo isn't better enough than simply making a different weapon. The min recoil version of this takes us to 39 ergonomics and 102 recoil with the 11-inch barrel, which you can just about squeak by with, but it's a little hairy. It feels somewhat like using an AKMS with the basic butt pad and cheap comp mods at the start of the wipe, and given you get to 39 ergonomics and 77 recoil with the long barrel, it feels kind of redundant. Due to this, we'll focus on the medium barrel. Like with the short barrel, when we swap out for the 16-inch, this means that the handguard also needs to be the shorter version, which is the one that we were using anyway. The min recoil version of this build, if we go and reattach the front attachment here, which is exactly the same as on the long version, gets you to 33 ergonomics and 88 vertical recoil by using the Veltor CSV, sticky back on the RK2 and the muzzle. If we want to improve this slightly, just by taking the RK2 and switching it out for the shift, this gets us to 45 ergonomics and 94 recoil unsuppressed, and also 31 ergo and 102 recoil suppressed. Unfortunately for me, this sacrifices too much recoil, as you can make the long-barreled version for 44 ergonomics and 81 recoil. This means that we basically have to step up the recoil sacrifice even more to make the Ergo something that we simply cannot make with the longer barreled weapon. If we then replace this one with the MOE stock instead and add the butt pad to that, this gets you to 52 ergonomics and 98 recoil. If you could deal with 98 recoil, this build is actually okay. Basically, the recoil isn't anywhere near as good as the more meta long barrel versions, but you can't make a long barreled SA-58 with 52 unsuppressed ergonomics for the same recoil, so this is really the only place where the medium length barrel kind of stands out. But ultimately, what really matters here is, does the ADS speed change from ergonomics make it worth sacrificing small points of recoil, or should we go all out in reducing the kick of this beast? So again, I'm going to throw up some tests that I did on the ergonomics of these weapons, comparing 0 all the way up to 52 that we have here. But I think the key takeaway is that because of the weight and the low ergonomics of a lot of these builds, there's some severe side pull which happens from 0 ergo and actually only really disappears once you get to about 43, which seems the sweet spot. Overall, I think that the best builds are either full min recoil and just deal with the 20 base ergo, or the shift Mesa MOE pad builds, which results in 39 ergonomics and 77 recoil pre-scopes, and gets us into the okay ergonomics section where we don't see huge weapon swings, but it doesn't remove too much recoil reduction either. One thing that can complicate the decision is that with semi-auto weapons, you can happily use the 3-part muzzle brake, benefit from the improved ergonomics, and other than being loud, feel very effective with those weapons. However, once you have the ability to go full auto, your gameplay will inevitably develop around this capability, taking into account the damage output that you have at your disposal, which should allow you to win certain fights in theory that wouldn't be possible with a semi-weapon. But with the muzzle brake builds, it can be really hard to see your target when spraying on full auto, simply because of the amount of muzzle flash and dust that obscures your vision when using a red dot style optic in line with the barrel, which isn't a problem on the semi-weapons because of the lower fire rate. One solution is obviously using a suppressor, but it's so hard to make this work for the builds as we've seen. Alternatively, using a hybrid scope of some kind that allows you to mount closer range red dots can really help with this, such as the Night Force rings or optics like the hammer with a delta point above it. Anything to prop up the reticle a bit and get it out of the way of the death inferno being released by the cannon underneath. Regarding magazines, so far through this entire discussion we've just assumed that the 30 round mag is the best. The SA-58 does also come with 10, 20 or 50 round options as well, but I feel that firstly staying with the smaller mags doesn't utilise the full auto capability of the SA particularly well, and because many other cheaper to mod weapons can take the 20s like the MDR, you want to be using the 30s at least with the SA to actually have some sustained level of fire when on full auto, especially with its slightly higher fire rate. On the other hand, the 50 round mags are just too expensive on your ergonomic stat, unless of course you're only going to be using it in close quarters and point shoot where it will excel. However, any situation where you need to use ADS, you're going to have a bad time, as the 50s hit ergo by 20, which is yet another 12 on top of the 30 round ergo penalty of 8. So if you do try to do everything, i.e. lowest recoil, suppressed, 50 round mag and a scope, you will actually hit a floor of ergonomics at 0. Even going unsuppressed with the 50 rounder and without any scope modifiers, this takes the recoil build to 8 ergonomics, which feels like trying to ADS with a tree trunk. If you do decide that you want to grab a drum, either for more sniper style gameplay prone where ADS doesn't matter, or for point blank close quarters, they are only available for the moment on the flea for cash. Mechanic will barter one for a G-phone though, which right now is only about 15,000, so is quite affordable. Ammo wise, I've discussed this before in my SR-25 video, which is chambered in the same round, but with M61 being the king here, this effectively ignores armor all the way up to level 6. M62 was nerfed, so it's close to M80 in performance, hence I don't really use it anymore, and as for M80, this is a decent budget round for using with cheap guns, but when you're running meta 7.6251 NATO weapons, I'd make sure that you're using M61 for best performance. M993 is for sniping, more expensive and faster rounds for no discernible improvement in performance, so only bother with these if you're shooting over extreme ranges and want to minimise the drop. Not so suitable for point blank full auto with the SA-58. If you learned something or enjoyed today's video and want to support the channel, please as always consider sending a like and a comment, as it helps with visibility for those who haven't found me yet on YouTube. You can follow me on Twitter and Twitch to check out when I'm live, which is currently 2 times a week, once on Friday at 9 PM UK time for the real-time recording of the Scav Talk podcast, which you can check out the link to in the description below, and a regular Tarkov stream on Saturday at 2 PM UK time in the afternoon. And with all that said, I'll see you next time, and as always, have fun in your raids.